Hello, my friends. I invite everyone to take their seats. I want to walk you through the full course of a recent meeting of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, AFET. We begin with the approval of the agenda. With no objections, the agenda is adopted. The meeting is streamed online as usual, with interpretation available. Spanish is on channel 8. Then attention turns to the main guest, the High Representative and Vice President Kaja Kallas, invited to share her view on the coming period for the EU's common foreign and security policy. On 2 December, the committee adopted its annual report on the implementation of the EU's foreign and security policy for 2025. That report tries to give a clear strategic orientation to EU foreign policy at a time of growing instability, pressure from authoritarian regimes, a weakened multilateral system, and intensifying global competition. The conclusion is simple. The European Union must respond with more unity, resilience, and capacity for action. The High Representative is given the floor. She starts by saying, "It is a pleasure to be here at the end of the year, and thanks the members for the support they've given to Europe's role in the world during an extremely difficult year." She hopes things will get easier, but realistically does not expect that to happen next year. Instead, Europe faces some of the defining challenges of this era: a war on the European continent, actors trying to overturn the rules-based international order, and shocks to the global system. At the same time, there are opportunities to deepen support for Ukraine, to build Europe's collective defense, to work with allies, and to cooperate closely with partners to encourage economic integration and regional stability. She gives 3 main examples of what has been achieved. First, European security and defense. The EU has managed to mobilize record levels of funding to support Ukraine's defense, as well as significant sanctions packages against Russia. These measures are designed to deprive Moscow of the funds needed to fuel its war machine. "We are talking about billions of euros," she notes, and insists there can be no complacency. The war continues because Russia refuses to stop. Vladimir Putin remains the primary obstacle to peace, despite narratives that try to suggest otherwise. This war is taking place on European soil. How it ends is crucial for Europe. It is in nobody's interest that Russia should seek and obtain more. Measured against the potential cost of a wider war in the EU, supporting Ukraine is, in her view, a cheaper and more rational choice. She stresses that influence only matters if it is used effectively. The EU must now also work on the proposed union-backed loan for reparations and further sanctions. Current estimates suggest that 135 billion euros will be needed for 2026 and 2027. The Commission has put forward these figures, including the loan for reparations, but these decisions must be taken collectively, the European way. Giving Ukraine the resources it needs to defend itself, she argues, is not about prolonging the war, but about helping to end it on terms that do not reward aggression. In parallel, the EU has carried out the most significant step change in defense policy since its creation, from the white paper to the roadmap to the 2020 preparedness strategy to military mobility and related initiatives. Europe is investing historically large sums in defense. That means building the capabilities required to keep EU citizens safe. New security and defense partnerships have been concluded with 8 countries, including the United Kingdom. These are already bearing fruit. For example, in joint financing for Ukraine with Norway, and in military cooperation with Japan to help protect freedom of navigation at sea. She recalls that last year, EU-supported efforts helped prevent a major attack off the coast of Somalia, illustrating the importance of EU military and civilian missions. At the same time, she agrees that more missions and operations should be tightly focused on clear, concrete objectives. Her second example is the defense of multilateralism. Multilateralism, she says, means multiple voices at the table and is the antidote to conflict, because it forces collective action in the face of shared challenges. It celebrates diversity and shows that incorporating different perspectives leads to better policy outcomes. Imperfect as it is, the multilateral system remains the best international framework we have. Some actors now openly question it. But in her view, the EU should not. Instead, the Union must reinforce its defense of multilateralism. And she pledges her commitment to that. She recalls the ministerial meeting on the Southern Dimension, attended for the first time in 14 years by Syria. It brought together North African states, Israel, and others after the terrible attacks in Israel. She chaired that meeting, which gathered over 100 delegations and more than 70 ministers. One important session focused on cooperation with the African Union and on increasing supplies of critical raw materials for AI, mobility, and other key technologies. The EU's global gateway projects, she says, continue to offer win-win opportunities in Africa and around the world. She then mentions the Indo-Pacific Regional Forum, which brought together countries from the African coast to the Pacific Islands, focusing on maritime security and the protection of underwater infrastructure. There, she observed a strong commitment to protecting data cables and strengthening resilience against threats. That work will continue. Her third example concerns work with partners across the world. Starting with the EU's closest neighbors, she notes that the enlargement agenda is now clear, and a union with more than 27 member states by 2030 is becoming a realistic perspective. EU leaders will discuss enlargement again next week. She highlights a significant increase in the alignment of candidate countries with the EU's foreign and security policy. This is not, she says, a mere box-ticking exercise, but a real alignment of values, attitudes, and joint action, something that should be welcomed. She also points out a trend. The closer a country is to the EU, the further it tends to be from Russian influence. Russia and its allies are redoubling efforts at interference campaigns, as seen in Armenia and elsewhere. Yet the EU has set clear targets and proven that when it acts together, it can overcome such interference. Countering foreign interference is a growing priority for the EU, and ambitions and resources devoted to it are rising. The Union will continue to mobilize the full toolkit of the EEAS and other bodies created in the past decade, including support for civil society and media freedom. As the example of Moldova shows, defending against interference and ensuring election integrity requires a whole-of-society approach, something the EU wants to help develop further, including through election observation missions and shared democratic experience. She then turns to partners in the Gulf and the Middle East. She recently visited Qatar and Jordan and saw firsthand the need to build a more structured relationship with that region. It is at the center of EU foreign policy, full of challenges but rich in opportunities. The EU remains the main facilitator of a two-state solution, focusing on practical requirements, for example, ensuring Gaza is governed by Palestinians with a Palestinian Authority that functions properly and can handle security. The EU is the principal financial backer of the Palestinian Authority and simultaneously the one pressing hardest for reform. EU police forces stand ready to train Palestinian police, and the Union is working along the broader criminal justice chain, offering training for prosecutors and judges to help judicial authorities in Ramallah and in the West Bank. Beyond Gaza, the EU contributes to regional security through confidence-building measures in Lebanon, including military de-escalation and dialogue with civil society. The Union lifted certain sanctions in order to support serious reform efforts in that country. Regarding the United States, she notes that Washington's national security strategy delivers a clear message. Europe must be aware of its positional realities vis-a-vis the US, Russia, and China. As a citizen who grew up under an autocratic regime, she stresses that the EU embodies freedom, and criticisms that portray the Union as an enemy of liberty miss that essential truth. In Russia, she reminds, there is no freedom of speech or media, and platforms like X or Twitter are banned. By contrast, the 27 EU member states voluntarily chose to cooperate closely, and other countries want to join this project. That alone shows its value. She underscores that the EU has significant economic weight in the world and more leverage vis-a-vis China than it often recognizes. The EU strategy lists all the instruments at its disposal. Used well and proactively, they can protect European economies and industries. But power is not free. To exercise it, Europe must increase and strategically deploy its resources. As negotiations begin on the next multi-annual financial framework, she hopes the Parliament will support adequate funding for global Europe and sufficient resources to manage almost 150 delegations around the world. She then briefly addresses an internal investigation at the EEAS, which has led to 2 resignations. She expresses full confidence that the competent authorities will safeguard the presumption of innocence and full confidence in EEAS staff who work daily to defend EU interests worldwide. She concludes her first intervention by saying that Europe should be proud of what it achieved this year under enormous pressure, but must also recognize that this is only the beginning. She thanks the committee for its support and commits to maintaining close contact. The floor then passes to the coordinators' questions. One MEP says he agrees with almost everything she has said, but wants to focus on what was left out. He insists that the EU is not an obstacle to peace and hopes that this will be understood in the United States as well, because Europe still sees itself as an ally. On Ukraine, he asks, how much do we really know about what is happening? There was talk of a 28-point plan reduced to 20 or 19 points with EU intervention. Then two negotiators met again in Moscow. A different text emerged, and Russia rejected what the EU had proposed. Where exactly do things stand, and what can the EU accept or not accept in terms of influence and red lines? He also asks about the reparations fund. Can we realistically expect a solution that would provide Ukraine with resources for reconstruction? Finally, he notes that the U.S. wants Europe to assume responsibility for the entire conventional segment of NATO defense by 2027. Does this not require a profound rethink of EU budget planning, the MFF, the SAFE program, and national defense budgets? He calls for better coordination of defense spending, warning that the U.S. strategy amounts almost to a threat. Another member from the Social Democrats notes that it's impossible to fix the world in so little time, but tries anyway. He shares the previous speaker's views on Ukraine, but presses for more detail on security and defense cooperation. What is the state of play regarding Turkey's request to join the SAFE program, he asks, and what kind of cooperation agreement would be needed first? He argues that the U.S. strategy towards the EU is not mere political disagreement, but an existential threat, and calls for a coherent, united response from the EU's top leadership. A member from a patriotic group criticizes the EU for focusing heavily on Ukraine and the Middle East while overlooking wars tearing Africa apart. He lists the enormous humanitarian crises in Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Cabo Delgado, and Mozambique, and beyond. Millions displaced, Christians murdered, jihadist violence spreading, monasteries emptied, mass graves. He calls this strategic myopia regarding Africa and insists the EU should act where it can actually make a positive difference. He also raises concerns about Brazil, where he says arbitrary judicial actions threaten the rule of law. Another MEP, speaking in Polish, says he does not share the skepticism towards U.S. diplomacy. He does not want Russia's border moving closer to Poland, but he criticizes the EU's Ukraine policy as too timid. Tanks and heavy armor were provided too late. Germany initially blocked the transfer of some anti-drone systems, and now France and Belgium refuse to cooperate over frozen Russian assets. He asks whether sufficient pressure is being applied on those member states. He also raises the catastrophic conditions in refugee camps in Bangladesh, funded largely by the EU, and asks what will be done to involve Arab countries in financing them. Then he turns to Latin America and Venezuela, asking whether the High Representative shares U.S. policy there. A liberal MEP criticizes the U.S. national security strategy for its insulting tone towards Europe. It says the real scandal is the EU's weak response. She notes that the document suggests Europe undermines sovereignty, mishandles migration, suppresses free speech, and destroys political opposition. How can the EU accept such characterizations from a supposed ally? She calls for a much more forceful and united reaction. Another member points out that Europe's migration policy and climate policy have harmed competitiveness in industry and claims that censorship is strangling democratic debate. In his view, the U.S. document simply describes reality. He says relations with Washington are excellent in his experience and insists that EU peace policy has failed because the Union has been sidelined in peace negotiations over Ukraine. Other speakers raise questions on Gaza, on alleged genocide against Palestinians, on the credibility of EU support for the Palestinian Authority if the EU does not sanction Israel's policies, on the ongoing annexation of territory in Gaza and the West Bank, the thousands of Palestinian prisoners, and the widespread torture allegations documented by the UN. They ask bluntly, what is the EU going to do beyond paying the Palestinian Authority while tolerating Israeli impunity? Members also highlight crises in Congo, Rwanda, Sudan, and the central role of Rwanda's Kagame in conflicts, while at the same time he is embraced by Western leaders. There is anger that the EU seems soft on him even as millions die. Another speaker insists the EU must be more explicit on Venezuela, defend human rights, and support democratic change, mentioning Maria Corina Machado receiving a major international prize. Several question the EU's ability to act independently of the US, especially when Washington's strategy document openly calls for weakening the EU, echoing far-right slogans about identity, low birth rates, and the erosion of trust. They argue that this should be a red flag, particularly because Russia applauds such narratives. Some suggest the EU should state openly that the US is no longer a trustworthy ally when it imposes tariffs, forces arms purchases, and draws Europe into complicity with what they describe as Netanyahu's crimes. They stress that silence or timid responses not only embolden Washington but also send the wrong signal to Vladimir Putin, who may see Europe as a doormat. Many call for a firm, point-by-point rebuttal. There are also questions about Moldova's EU accession path, the adequacy of budgets for EU external action, the security partnership with the UK, and why London is not fully participating in SAFE, and about Turkey's internal repression and the stalled peace process with the Kurds. After this heavy round of questions and criticisms, the High Representative responds on Ukraine. She says there are ongoing talks between Ukraine and the United States and between the US and Russia. She sees little pressure being applied on Russia to negotiate in earnest, which is why the EU focuses on that part of the equation. Without such pressure, there is a real risk of a so-called peace agreement that effectively rewards aggression, leading to more aggression in the future. The EU has set out its red lines clearly: sovereignty, territorial integrity, the return of abducted Ukrainian children, and more. It is vital to keep raising these points and to maintain pressure on Russia. She confirms work on the reparations loan is ongoing, with an agreement expected soon, which would send an important signal. Russia cannot act with impunity, and those who cause damage must pay for it. On U.S. defense expectations, she says the EU is already working closely with defense ministers. The challenge is to shift their mindset from purely national to a more transnational perspective, coordinating national budgets while respecting national competences. The EU is trying to build coalitions of capabilities led by member states, promoting joint procurement, joint projects, and addressing the fact that some capabilities are too costly for single countries. Interoperability is another key issue. This is why there is a roadmap pushing member states forward. Governments remain in the driver's seat, she says, but the car must move. Being a driver is not enough. One must actually drive. On defense partnerships, she notes that the deadline for joining the first SAFE wave was the end of November. The countries that are in are those that applied in time. Member states can also choose their own partners within certain limits. Turkey's participation faces resistance from some capitals, and that has been taken into account. On the U.S. strategy document, she says Europe must have more self-confidence. Many statements in that document simply do not reflect reality in Europe. Some are provocations designed to elicit reaction and attention. While one can dig through every line, the EU knows these claims are false. She points out that an article in the Financial Times compared the situation in Europe and the U.S. on the very indicators highlighted in the strategy and found that the U.S. is not doing better. Her approach is to stay calm, focus on substance, and keep working with the U.S. where possible without allowing divisive rhetoric to fracture Europe internally. The U.S. remains Europe's main ally in reality, she argues, and Europe must avoid unnecessary ruptures at a time of huge global challenges. On Sudan, Congo, Mozambique, and other African conflicts, she says the deeper problem is that the agreed global rules embedded in multilateral organizations are no longer being applied consistently. The world is changing. The rules-based order is under intense attack. The EU's role must be to defend that order, including the UN Charter's clear limits on what states may and may not do to other states, and the principle of accountability. If violations go unpunished, impunity grows and more conflicts follow. Practically, The EU has multiple missions and operations in Africa, but each mission consumes resources, and member states often demand new missions without providing the necessary troops or funding. That is why she wants a sharper focus, clearly defined goals for each mission, and genuine listening to local partners about what they actually need, rather than deciding only what the EU wants to offer. One key EU role is to prevent tensions and spillover into neighboring countries. The Union is working closely with African counterparts on that. On the criticism that EU policy on Ukraine has been timid, she accepts that if all member states had provided military aid to Ukraine in the first months at the level they are providing now, the course of the war might have been different. However, she rejects the claim that Germany has been dragging its feet. Berlin has provided substantial support, including major shifts in policy and the important role it plays in the reparations loan discussions. They are not the ones blocking progress, she insists. On Rwanda, Congo, and Sudan, she notes that the EU has adopted restrictive measures against certain individuals and entities, especially in relation to Rwanda. Consultations with Rwanda are ongoing and more may be needed. She acknowledges that a peace agreement on paper does not mean real peace on the ground. Lasting peace requires the commitment of entire societies, rejecting hate speech and vengeful behavior. That is why the EU works with civil society and supports whole-of-society approaches. Returning to Israel-Palestine, she points out that the EU as such is not exporting weapons. It is member states that have their own trade and arms arrangements. Still, the EU needs to do more. She proposed sanctions on violent settlers. 26 countries agreed, one resisted. This demonstrates that a strong majority wants to move forward, but unanimity is still required. The EU remains in constant contact with Israeli authorities and with other regional actors, pressing them to halt actions that undermine peace. With a fragile ceasefire in place, the EU supports the idea of an international stabilization force, though its mandate and composition are unclear. The countries willing to contribute troops do not want to be tasked with disarming Hamas. That, she says, must be done by Palestinian authorities and police. The EU has offered to train those forces through its mission so that Palestinians themselves can undertake disarmament. On accountability for Russian war crimes, she brings one concrete piece of good news. On 16 December, in The Hague, the Commission for Claims Relating to the War will be formally established, a specialized tribunal mechanism to pursue reparations and responsibility. The EU has not forgotten this dimension and is working to ensure there is a proper accountability architecture. Regarding third countries' relations with Russia, she says much of her diplomacy happens out of public view. She has personally convinced some leaders not to meet with Putin because he needs such meetings to project international legitimacy and normalize his actions. Whether they were willing to admit it or not, those meetings were giving him that recognition. She reiterates that there is a global battle of narratives, who is for war and who is for peace. Russia is trying hard to depict the EU as an obstacle to peace. The reality is the opposite. Yet many countries have historic ties to Russia and believe its narrative, even though the EU often provides far more financial support. The EU's task is to patiently present its own story and show that it is defending the UN Charter and international law. On Moldova, she confirms that negotiations are progressing well, especially after large EU efforts to help the country resist interference and external malign influence. The situation there is improved. On budgets, she is frank. The current resources are not sufficient. With 145 delegations, rising security threats, and the expanded global Europe agenda, more funding is needed. She hopes Parliament will support increases for external action in the MFF. At the same time, she stresses that the EEAS is undertaking internal reforms to become more agile, relevant, and effective. On the UK and the SAFE program, she says she was not directly involved in those negotiations and regrets that no agreement was reached for full UK participation. However, the UK can still be involved via bilateral agreements with member states. Up to 35% of SAFE-related cooperation can come from partners outside the EU, so London is not excluded from defense cooperation. She returns once more to the core of the Ukraine issue. Europe is a peace project, she says, and the EU genuinely wants peace. But peace requires both parties. In February, Ukraine accepted an unconditional ceasefire. Russia has continued to attack Ukrainian cities. Around 93% of Russian strikes have hit civilian targets, hospitals, schools, energy infrastructure, causing massive suffering. The party refusing peace, in her view, is clearly Russia. Therefore, the EU must keep up pressure on Moscow to stop pretending to negotiate and actually agree to a ceasefire as the first step toward real talks. On self-confidence and responding to U.S. rhetoric, she emphasizes that the EU should not sink into personal attacks or regime change language about the U.S. The goal is not to interfere in another country's internal politics, but to strengthen Europe itself, its own defense industry, its own resilience and autonomy. In practice, that is what the EU is doing, diversifying partnerships around the world, reducing harmful dependencies, and proving itself a reliable partner for many countries. On Venezuela, she reiterates that the EU does not consider Maduro's regime legitimate and sees it as essential to maintain engagement with democratic forces there, support the fight against transnational organized crime, and remain present on the ground. During her trips to Latin America and the Caribbean for the CELAC summit, she heard clearly how drug cartels and gangs are capturing state institutions, creating problems that ultimately reach Europe too. The EU, she says, must show that it still stands for rules, law, and multilateral solutions in a world that seems increasingly chaotic. On Jerusalem and the incident of Israel lowering the UN flag, she stresses again that the EU itself is not arming Israel, and that any perception of complicity must be weighed against the legal responsibilities and competences of member states. Nonetheless, she agrees that more must be done and mentions once more the push for sanctions on violent settlers and the EU's efforts to support humanitarian access and a sustainable ceasefire that could lead to a genuine two-state solution. Finally, she acknowledges that the budgets for external action have been cut while global challenges have increased. She calls on Parliament to back more resources for global Europe and for the delegations, insisting that this is not just about spending more, but about reforming EU external action so it is quicker, more relevant, and more effective. The chair thanks her for these detailed replies, notes that this committee is her natural home in Parliament, and closes the session, announcing the next meeting on 11 December at 9 in the morning. That is the full trajectory of the meeting. A European Union under pressure, trying to define its place between a war in Ukraine, instability in the Middle East and Africa, a shifting relationship with the United States, and a contested global order, and trying, at least in its own eyes, to reconcile support for Ukraine, defense of multilateralism, and a more autonomous European voice in the world.